if a televised town hall stopped being a debate and quietly became a stress test of a system, where rhetoric met paperwork, where timing mattered more than volume, and where institutional habits collided with public scrutiny? In this hypothetical scenario, the question is not who is right, but how narratives behave when confronted by process, procedure, and consequences no one can fully control. The morning began with the kind of quiet that only exists before a controlled spectacle. In this hypothetical scenario, nothing had yet gone wrong, and that was precisely the point. A nationally televised town hall is not designed for surprise. It is engineered for rhythm, for predictability, for the slow exchange of rehearsed ideas that leave institutions intact and reputations largely untouched. Everyone involved understood that. The audience, the network, the moderators, the candidates, all of them entered the space assuming the system would behave as it always had. Elizabeth Warren woke before dawn in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in a house whose value was often cited by supporters and critics alike, but rarely examined for what it represented: insulation, not from criticism, but from consequence. Sunlight moved through the tall windows of the Victorian home, touching shelves of books on bankruptcy law, consumer protection, and regulatory history. The walls carried photographs meant to signal continuity: presidents, senators, moments of reform frozen into frames. In this hypothetical account, those images were not ironic. They were credentials, assembled carefully over decades. By 7:30 a.m., her senior staff had arrived. Coffee was poured. Briefing binders were opened. The CNN town hall scheduled for that evening was, on paper, an opportunity, not a risk. Polling showed her holding steady with progressive voters, stalled nationally but respected, trusted. The plan was straightforward: speak first, define the frame, establish moral contrast. Donald Trump would follow, responding rather than shaping, reacting rather than controlling. The first half hour of preparation focused on language, not what to say, but how to say it. The tone needed to be firm, prosecutorial without sounding personal. The word corruption would be used sparingly but deliberately, always attached to systems, incentives, outcomes, corporate capture, regulatory rollback, tax asymmetry. Each phrase had been tested in focus groups. Each statistic had been verified and cross-verified. In a system that rewards credibility theater, preparation is protection. Her chief of staff walked her through anticipated lines of attack: corporate tax policy, cabinet appointments, labor protections weakened through administrative action. Nothing new, nothing unmanageable. Warren listened, annotated, nodded. In this hypothetical telling, there was no arrogance in the room, only confidence born of repetition. She had made this argument before, many times, in hearings and campaigns and classrooms. She believed sincerely that clarity would carry the night. What she could not see, and had no reason to anticipate, was that the symmetry of the evening, the clean division of time, the orderly exchange of critique and response, depended entirely on mutual compliance with norms that were not written but assumed. The format worked only if everyone treated it as what it claimed to be: a conversation. Several hundred miles away, in a high-rise conference room overlooking Manhattan, Donald Trump was also preparing, but not in the usual way. In this hypothetical version of events, there was no rehearsal of talking points, no effort to anticipate questions. The binders on the table were not message documents. They were archival, contracts, disclosures, timelines, material assembled not to persuade, but to confront. The room was quiet. No television played in the background. Trump sat at the head of the table, not reading, but listening. The research team spoke in measured tones, aware that what they were presenting was not argument, but structure. The premise was simple. If the evening became a discussion of values, Warren would be comfortable. If it became a discussion of records, the outcome was uncertain. "This is all public," one researcher said, not defensively but precisely. "Disclosures, filings, committee reports, nothing classified, nothing speculative." Trump nodded. In this scenario, he asked few questions, and none of them were emotional. What matters, he understood, was not accusation, but sequence. Order creates authority. Evidence presented slowly carries more weight than rhetoric delivered loudly. The goal was not to win an exchange, but to disrupt the expectation that exchanges were the point. By mid-afternoon, Warren was in makeup at CNN's Atlanta studio. The atmosphere was familiar. Technicians adjusted lighting. Audience members were seated according to demographic balance. The moderators reviewed timing cues. Nothing suggested deviation. The system was functioning. At 7:00 p.m., the broadcast began. Anderson Cooper introduced Warren. Applause followed, polite and warm. The first question came from a nurse, then a teacher, then a small business owner. Warren responded with fluency, weaving personal stories into policy analysis, translating abstraction into grievance. The audience responded as expected. Heads nodded. Applause rose and fell on cue. For an hour, the format held. Warren spoke about inequality not as a slogan, but as a mechanism. How tax codes shape behavior. How regulatory gaps compound over time. How systems reward those who understand how to navigate them. She did not name Trump often. She did not need to. The contrast was implicit. Her confidence grew as the clock moved forward. This was familiar ground. When her segment ended, the applause lingered. She thanked the audience, shook hands, and exited the stage with the satisfaction of someone who believed she had done exactly what the system asked of her. In the green room, her staff exchanged relieved glances. The narrative, they believed, had been set. Trump entered the stage at 8:30. He did not sit. That detail mattered more than it should have. In a format built on visual cues, deviation registers immediately. Trump placed a folder on the moderator's table and stood beside it, hands resting lightly on the surface. The first question was asked, but he did not answer it directly. Instead, he acknowledged Warren's previous remarks, thanked the audience for listening, and then calmly asked whether Senator Warren was still in the building. In this hypothetical scenario, the request was procedural, almost casual, but the room reacted before the moderators could. A murmur moved through the audience. Cameras adjusted. The assumption that the night would proceed in sequence fractured. Backstage, Warren was informed of the request. There was no accusation yet, no context. Just a question, delivered through production staff, carrying the implicit weight of uncertainty. Declining would be noticed. Accepting would mean re-entering a space that no longer followed its original script. She returned to the stage. The chair opposite Trump was waiting. The folder remained closed. In this hypothetical account, what followed was not a shouting match, nor a viral moment engineered for spectacle. It was something quieter, and therefore more destabilizing. Trump did not accuse. He referenced dates, amounts, documents displayed on screen not as proof of guilt, but as artifacts of participation in the very systems under discussion. The audience leaned forward, not because they had been told to, but because attention had shifted from opinion to process. Warren responded as she always had, with explanation, with context, with the language of complexity. And for a moment, that language held. But the structure of the exchange had changed. Questions were no longer about belief or intention. They were about sequence and consequence. This hypothetical scenario does not assign verdicts. It does not declare truth. What it examines is something more procedural. What happens when a system designed for narrative encounters documentation, and whether credibility behaves differently under that pressure. The town hall, intended as a forum for ideas, had become something else entirely. Not a trial, but a demonstration of how fragile assumptions can be when formats are bent without breaking rules. As the segment continued, the audience's role shifted from spectator to witness. Not to wrongdoing, necessarily, but to dissonance. The space between how institutions describe themselves and how they operate is rarely visible in real time. In this scenario, that space had been illuminated, not by accusation, but by juxtaposition. And once seen, it could not be unseen. The night was no longer about Donald Trump or Elizabeth Warren as individuals. It had become a case study in how systems absorb pressure, how reputations are constructed within them, and how quickly equilibrium can collapse when the rules are followed, but the expectations are not. When the camera cut to commercial, the folder was still on the table, unopened sections waiting. The audience was silent, and whatever came next, the system would not return to its original shape. This was only the beginning. The return to the stage altered the geometry of the room. In a format built on symmetry, one chair, one question, one answer, the presence of two figures facing each other across a narrow table changed the audience's posture without anyone instructing them to move. This was no longer a sequence of voter concerns and prepared responses. It was an encounter, and everyone could feel that the rules governing encounters are different from those governing performances. Trump did not rush. He did not raise his voice. He acknowledged Warren's earlier remarks again, almost courteously, and framed his response not as disagreement, but as continuation. In this hypothetical scenario, the distinction mattered. He was not rebutting her arguments. He was repositioning the conversation around provenance, where claims originate, how authority is constructed, and what survives scrutiny when context is stripped away. The folder was opened, but not theatrically. One document was placed on the table, angled so the cameras could capture it without zooming. Trump described it without adjectives, identifying the year, the parties involved, and the purpose as stated on the page. He did not accuse Warren of wrongdoing. He asked whether the document was authentic. Warren answered as a lawyer would. She contextualized. She explained. She placed the document within a professional ecosystem in which expert analysis is routine and compensated accordingly. Her tone remained measured, but something had shifted beneath it. The audience was no longer evaluating positions. They were watching a process unfold, step by step, in real time. Trump listened, nodded once, and introduced a second document, then a third. Each time, he asked the same question, framed slightly differently: whether the document accurately reflected her professional engagement during the period in question. Each time, Warren responded with explanation rather than denial. And each time, the distance between explanation and answer became more visible. In a political debate, ambiguity can be protective. In a procedural examination, it can feel evasive. The audience began to react not to what was being said, but to how it was being said. When an audience member asked whether the compensation totals were accurate, the question landed with unexpected force. Not because of the number, but because it reduced an abstract exchange to a measurable claim. Warren hesitated. Not long, but long enough to be noticed. She acknowledged that she had received compensation for professional services over many years. She emphasized legality, industry norms, and the difference between advocacy and analysis. None of it was implausible, but the format no longer rewarded plausibility. It rewarded clarity. Trump did not interrupt. He allowed the explanation to end, then asked a narrower question, not whether the work was legal, not whether it was common, but whether it was financially significant relative to the public persona Warren had cultivated. The question reframed the issue from compliance to coherence. This was the moment the system revealed its vulnerability. The town hall had been designed to accommodate disagreement, even confrontation. It had not been designed to adjudicate consistency between identity and record. The moderators attempted to steer the conversation back toward policy, but the audience resisted, not vocally at first, but through attention. Eyes remained fixed on the table, on the documents, on the unanswered parts of each response. The exchange continued methodically. Trump introduced another category of material: organizational charts, settlement summaries, publicly available reports describing institutional mechanisms. He described how certain regulatory outcomes were structured, not asserting intent, but outlining consequence. He asked Warren to explain the design choices, not their morality, but their function. Warren responded by emphasizing mission, consumer protection, community remediation, structural reform. These were words she had used for years, and they were not unfamiliar to the audience. But in this hypothetical scenario, familiarity worked against her. The words felt rehearsed in a moment that no longer followed rehearsal. An audience member stood and asked whether those mechanisms could, in theory, be repurposed to serve political ends. Warren objected to the premise. Trump did not engage the objection. He returned to the documents, pointing to criteria, to eligibility lists, to patterns. Again, he did not accuse. He asked whether the pattern existed. This distinction between asserting motive and demonstrating structure defined the remainder of the segment. The audience did not need to be told what to think. They were watching two different languages collide, one oriented toward values, the other toward systems. As the conversation moved forward, the tension increased not because of escalation, but because of compression. Each question narrowed the range of acceptable responses. Each explanation that exceeded that range heightened the sense that something essential was being avoided, even if unintentionally. When the topic shifted to financial disclosures and timing, the room grew quieter. Not because the subject was scandalous, but because it was technical. Dates, intervals, sequences. These are not the tools of political theater, but they are the raw materials of accountability. Trump laid them out without commentary. He asked Warren whether the timing appeared coincidental to her. Warren invoked delegation, advisors, distance between decision and execution. These were not unreasonable explanations, but the audience had begun to understand that reasonableness was no longer the metric. Alignment was. A woman in the audience spoke up, not angrily, but with something closer to disappointment. She asked whether Warren believed the public could reasonably perceive a conflict, regardless of intent. The question hung in the air longer than any accusation could have. Warren attempted to answer, but her response drifted toward reassurance rather than resolution. Trump remained still. He did not capitalize on the moment. He waited. That restraint changed the tone of the room more than any rhetorical flourish could have. The audience was not being led. They were being allowed to arrive at conclusions on their own, and that autonomy intensified the experience. This was no longer about persuasion. It was about exposure to complexity, to contradiction, to the limits of narrative control. As the segment approached its midpoint, Warren's composure remained outwardly intact, but the effort required to maintain it was visible. She adjusted her posture. She leaned forward, then back. Her answers became longer, more detailed, as though precision could restore equilibrium. But the equilibrium had shifted. The system had been stretched into a shape it did not recognize. The moderators attempted again to redirect, citing time constraints and audience questions. Trump acknowledged the reminder and agreed to proceed, but only after completing the sequence he had begun. He introduced one final set of documents for the segment: personnel listings, historical records, materials that spoke not to actions, but to identity. Warren objected immediately, labeling the line of inquiry inappropriate. Trump did not respond directly. He stated calmly that identity becomes relevant when it has been institutionally recognized and materially consequential. He asked whether the records accurately reflected how she had been categorized at various points in her career. The question was precise. The implications were broad. Warren began to speak, but stopped. The pause was brief, but in a live setting, pauses are amplified. The audience did not interrupt. They waited. In this hypothetical scenario, that pause marked the point of no return, not because of what it proved, but because of what it revealed about control. The night had begun with carefully managed roles and expectations. It had become an open system, responsive not to intention, but to input. The camera cut briefly to the audience. Faces were serious, attentive, unsettled. Not hostile, not celebratory. This was not spectacle. It was recognition. When Warren resumed speaking, her tone had changed. The cadence was faster, the language less structured. She attempted to reassert the broader stakes, to remind the audience of why she had entered public life, what she believed in, what she had fought for. These were not empty claims, but they no longer answered the questions being asked. Trump listened, then closed the folder. He did not declare victory. He did not summarize. He said only that systems have memories, even when people prefer to forget, and that when records surface, narratives must adapt or collapse. He turned to the moderator and indicated he was finished. The chair across from him was no longer just a seat. It was a symbol of participation in a process that no longer guaranteed protection through familiarity. Warren remained standing for a moment, as though deciding whether to continue engaging under altered conditions. The audience waited. What happened next would not be determined by applause or polling or even truth in the conventional sense. It would be determined by whether a system built on controlled exchange could survive sustained exposure to its own internal contradictions. And that question was still unanswered as the cameras rolled on. By the time the cameras returned from commercial, the room no longer felt like a broadcast set. The lighting was the same, the seating unchanged, but the atmosphere had shifted from performance to observation. No one was waiting to be convinced. They were waiting to see what would happen when a system designed for managed dialogue was forced to continue without the protection of its usual guardrails. Warren remained standing for a moment longer than expected before sitting back down. The movement was small, but it registered. Sitting signaled participation, acceptance of the altered frame, even if reluctantly. She adjusted her microphone, straightened the papers in front of her, and looked not at Trump, but at the moderator, as though appealing to the original architecture of the evening. Anderson Cooper acknowledged the unusual nature of the exchange, reminding viewers that this was a hypothetical discussion meant to explore ideas and records, not render judgments. His words were careful, almost legalistic, but even as he spoke, it was clear that the format had already slipped beyond his control. The system was running, and no single actor could stop it without cost. Trump reopened the folder, this time to a thinner section. He did not present it immediately. Instead, he described the category it represented: institutional design, how rules are written, how discretion is allocated, how outcomes follow from structure even in the absence of intent. The language was deliberately neutral. He was no longer addressing Warren directly. He was addressing the idea that systems can produce consequences independent of the morality of their designers. Warren listened, her expression guarded. When he finally placed the documents on the table, they were not contracts or checks. They were flowcharts, excerpts from reports, summaries of settlement mechanisms, material that required interpretation, not reaction. This was unfamiliar terrain for a televised political exchange. It demanded attention rather than alignment. Trump described, hypothetically, how regulatory settlements can be structured to route funds in different directions, how decisions about remediation can be centralized or dispersed, how criteria for eligibility can expand or narrow the scope of beneficiaries. He did not assert that any choice was corrupt. He asked whether Warren believed those choices were neutral. Warren responded by defending intent. She spoke about harm reduction, about reaching underserved communities, about the limitations of individual restitution in systemic cases. Her arguments were coherent, consistent with positions she had taken publicly for years. But again, the frame had shifted. Intent was no longer sufficient. The audience had been invited to consider consequence as a standalone metric. An audience member raised his hand and asked whether the same mechanisms could be adopted by a future administration with different values. The question was not hostile. It was speculative. Warren acknowledged the possibility, then emphasized safeguards. Trump did not interrupt. When she finished, he asked whether those safeguards were codified or discretionary. The silence that followed was not accusatory. It was analytical. The kind of silence that occurs when a system is being examined rather than defended. As the exchange continued, the questions grew narrower. Not broader philosophical disputes, but specific junctions where discretion met authority. Warren's responses grew more detailed, more technical. She cited statutes, internal guidelines, precedent. But the audience was no longer following every detail. They were watching the effort itself. The attempt to rebuild complexity as a shield after simplicity had been stripped away. Trump shifted again, this time to a timeline. Not dramatic, just a sequence of dates and actions laid out in order. He described committee briefings, market reactions, public announcements. He asked Warren whether the sequence was accurate. She did not deny it. She explained it. This distinction mattered. In a courtroom, explanation can be exculpatory. In a public forum, explanation can feel like avoidance if the question being asked is narrower than the answer being given. The audience reacted subtly. A murmur, then quiet. No shouting. No applause, just attention. Warren invoked delegation again. The complexity of modern financial management, the impracticality of personal oversight. These were reasonable claims, but they collided with a growing perception that reasonableness was no longer the relevant standard. The audience had begun to measure coherence between role and behavior, not legality alone. Another audience member spoke, this time a man who identified himself as having worked in compliance. He asked whether Warren believed public officials should be held to a higher standard than private actors, even when operating within the law. The question reframed the entire exchange. It removed Trump from the equation entirely. Warren hesitated, then answered yes. The answer landed heavily. not because it incriminated her, but because it established a benchmark that would now be applied retroactively. Trump did not respond immediately. He let the implications settle. The system was now evaluating itself. He then asked whether Warren believed her own conduct met that higher standard. Not legally, ethically, systemically, as an example. The question was quiet, almost gentle, and it was devastating precisely because it did not accuse. It invited self-assessment in a space where self-assessment is rarely rewarded. Warren began to answer, then stopped. She restarted, choosing different words. She spoke about decades of service, about outcomes achieved, about consumers protected. These were not false claims, but they did not address the question as posed. The audience noticed. At this point, the moderators attempted to intervene more assertively, citing time and balance. Trump acknowledged them, but asked to complete one final line of inquiry. He turned again to identity, not as an accusation, but as an institutional artifact. How categories are assigned, how they are recorded, how they persist even when later reconsidered. Warren objected, stating that the topic had been addressed publicly years earlier and resolved. Trump agreed that it had been discussed. He asked whether it had been corrected at the institutional level, whether records had been amended, whether benefits derived from those classifications had been reassessed. These were administrative questions, not moral ones, and they were far more difficult to answer cleanly. Warren's response grew sharper. She accused Trump of bad faith, of distraction, of weaponizing documentation to undermine reform. The emotion was real, the frustration visible. But the system no longer rewarded emotion. It was too late for that. The audience was not choosing sides. They were watching a process exhaust itself. When an audience member asked a direct question, whether Warren believed the public had been misled at any point, the room held its breath. This was not a trap. It was a genuine request for clarity. Warren did not answer directly. She spoke about family stories, about evolving understanding, about good faith. Again, none of it implausible. But the question had been binary, and the answer was not. Trump closed the folder again. This time, he did not reopen it. He said that systems do not require villains to fail, only misalignment between design and accountability. He stated that what the audience had witnessed was not an argument, but a demonstration of how power behaves when its narratives are interrupted by records. He did not say Warren was wrong. He did not say she was guilty. He said that the system she had described, one that rewards expertise, complexity, and insider knowledge, also insulates those who operate within it from the consequences they impose on others. And that insulation, once visible, cannot be unseen. Warren stood. This was not planned. There was no cue. She stood as though the chair itself had become untenable. She spoke forcefully now, abandoning measured cadence. She accused Trump of turning a civic forum into an ambush, of exploiting asymmetry, of undermining trust. The words came quickly, overlapping. The moderators attempted to regain control, but the system no longer recognized authority signals. An audience member called out, asking for a yes or no answer to a question that had gone unanswered for nearly 20 minutes. Another echoed it. Then another, not chanting, just repetition, the simplest form of accountability. Warren looked around the room, not at Trump, at the audience, at faces that had applauded her an hour earlier and now looked conflicted, not hostile. She realized, in that moment, that the exchange had escaped the realm of political damage control. Whatever she said next would not be absorbed as explanation. It would be interpreted as response to exposure. She said she would not continue under those conditions. She stepped away from the table. The movement was decisive, not theatrical. No words followed. The chair remained empty. For a moment, no one spoke. The moderators froze. The audience did not applaud. Trump remained seated, hands folded, saying nothing. The system had reached a terminal state, not through force, but through withdrawal. The cameras stayed live. What viewers saw was not a confrontation resolved, but a process interrupted. A system designed to absorb conflict had encountered a form of scrutiny it could not metabolize. The exchange ended not with a verdict, but with absence. And absence, in a system that depends on participation, carries its own consequences. As the broadcast struggled toward closure, it was already clear that the night would not be remembered for arguments made or rebuttals delivered. It would be remembered as the moment when narrative lost its monopoly, and records, quiet, procedural, indifferent, were allowed to speak long enough to destabilize the frame itself. The consequences of that destabilization had not yet begun to unfold, but they were inevitable. The empty chair did more work than any argument could have. In the seconds after Warren stepped away, the audience did not erupt. There was no outrage, no applause, no release. The absence created a vacuum the format had no protocol for filling. A system built on presence, on participation, on the assumption that every exchange continues until time expires, had encountered refusal, not rebuttal, not collapse, withdrawal. And withdrawal, in institutional terms, is not neutral. Anderson Cooper attempted to close the segment with a reminder about the hypothetical nature of the discussion, about the importance of civility, about the need to return to issues affecting everyday Americans. His voice was steady, but the words felt detached from the reality unfolding in the room. The audience was no longer processing messaging. They were processing meaning. Trump gathered the papers slowly, without ceremony, and placed them back into the folder. He did not speak to the empty chair. He did not address Warren's exit. He turned to the camera and said only that systems reveal themselves when pressure is applied, and that accountability is rarely comfortable for those accustomed to controlling the terms of debate. Then he thanked the audience and stepped away. The broadcast ended without resolution. Within minutes, the footage began to circulate, not selectively edited, not reframed with commentary, but largely intact. Clips spread not because they were sensational, but because they were incomplete. Viewers shared them with captions that posed questions rather than assertions. What just happened? Why didn't she answer? Is this how accountability looks now? In this hypothetical scenario, the reaction did not divide neatly along partisan lines. Some viewers defended Warren, arguing that the exchange had violated norms, that documentation without context can mislead, that procedural complexity cannot be reduced to binary answers. Others were unsettled not by what had been shown, but by how it had been shown, calmly, methodically, without accusation. The discomfort came from recognition, not persuasion. Newsrooms scrambled overnight to contextualize what they had aired. Analysts debated whether the format had been abused or merely repurposed. Editorial meetings focused less on truth claims and more on precedent. If town halls could be bent this way, if documentation could displace dialogue, what did that mean for future civic rituals? Warren's team issued a statement emphasizing the hypothetical nature of the exchange and condemning what they described as a breakdown of good faith engagement. The language was familiar, precise, defensive. It did not address the unanswered questions directly. It did not need to. The questions were already circulating independently. In the days that followed, the story evolved not as a scandal, but as a case study. Law professors debated the ethics of expertise and compensation. Regulatory scholars discussed the unintended consequences of institutional design. Commentators noted how easily narratives of moral authority can be destabilized when records are reintroduced into public view without interpretation. What made the hypothetical aftermath unusual was not outrage, but erosion. Polling did not collapse overnight. Donors did not flee en masse. Instead, hesitation appeared. Invitations were reconsidered, endorsements delayed, interviews postponed. The system responded the way systems often do, not with judgment, but with distancing. Warren continued to speak publicly, but the cadence had changed. Questions that once invited elaboration now demanded clarification. Explanations that once satisfied now generated follow-ups. The margin for ambiguity narrowed. This was not punishment. It was recalibration. In this hypothetical narrative, the most consequential shift occurred quietly. Other figures, politicians, regulators, institutional leaders, watched the footage and recognized themselves not in Warren's responses, but in the structure of the exchange. They saw how easily professional norms could be reframed as vulnerabilities when extracted from their protective contexts. They understood that the issue was not guilt or innocence, but exposure. Systems depend on shared assumptions about how scrutiny works. That night disrupted those assumptions. It demonstrated that accountability does not always arrive through formal mechanisms. Sometimes it emerges when formats fail to contain inquiry, when complexity is no longer treated as insulation, and when participation itself becomes optional. For Warren, the hypothetical consequences were not defined by a single moment, but by accumulation. Each appearance carried the residue of that night. Each unanswered question echoed longer than any explanation could. Her credibility did not vanish. It thinned. And thinning in political life can be fatal. For Trump, the outcome was not vindication. It was leverage. He had not proven anything. He had changed the terrain. By refusing to argue values and instead interrogating structure, he had demonstrated a tactic that others could replicate. The precedent mattered more than the result. The audience from that night would later describe a shared sensation, not of witnessing a takedown, but of watching a system lose its ability to protect one of its own through familiarity alone. The town hall had ceased to be a stage and had briefly become a lens. In the end, the hypothetical story is not about who won. It is about what was revealed when the usual safeguards of narrative control were suspended. It is about how institutions respond when asked to account not for intentions, but for consequences. And it is about how quickly authority can feel provisional when documentation is allowed to interrupt performance. The night did not end a career. It altered a trajectory. And once altered, trajectories rarely return to their original path.